Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, February 9th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about Joe Biden's pathway to victory through building back the blue wall. On your screen right now is the 2024 presidential electoral map with not a single state characterized. But in this election cycle, we are really only focused on a few battleground states that will determine the outcome of the presidency this coming November. Now, on both sides of the aisle, regardless of who's nominated, Biden, Trump, Haley, DeSantis, whatever it might be, there are states that are going to go pretty solidly for either side of the aisle. Democrats are going to win the coastal states, and Republicans are going to win a lot of the states in the South and the middle of America. But for a lot of the states, they really are, very solid, but some are quite competitive. I think we're looking at an American electorate that is quite boring because we're looking at a map nearly identical to the one we saw in the last election cycle. The reason being, the candidates. Do they look familiar? Well, they're going to be the exact same people this election again. Biden versus Trump is turning into Biden versus Trump again. Donald Trump now, who will be the third, consecutive Republican nominee, something that I find to be very interesting when you look at it from a historical lens, but makes a lot of sense when you look at it from the practical lens of where we are today in American politics. It's so fascinating. It's so interesting, but something that I think we could have predicted even just 3 years ago. And so when we take a look at our map for the 2024 election cycle, like I said, building back the blue wall comes with a cost. I think Democrats here need to realize that there is a lot of bleeding going on across the United States in terms of residual support from the last election cycle. On your screen right now, I'm going to characterize all of the states and districts that voted for either side of the aisle in the 2020 election and the 2016 election pretty consistently, with the exception of Nebraska's 2nd District, which I will characterize for right now as a state that, is a district that is going to the Democrats. But the rest of the states and districts have voted the same way. Since 2016, they've been pretty solid in voting for the Democrats, voting for the Republicans, and you really don't see much movement there. But this election cycle, I think you are going to see some movement. I think you are going to keep a lot of these safe states safe. But a lot in terms of movement, you're going to see margins narrow up and expand depending on which direction you're looking at. And right now, Donald Trump is doing a lot better than he did in the last election cycle. As I was saying, on the Democratic side, there's a lot of bleeding going on, and that bleeding comes, again, from that residual and leftover support from the last cycle. States in Arizona, such as Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, are states where you find Democrats to be, very solid back in 2020, very solid in the midterm elections, but not too solid this election cycle. And I think that's a problem the Democrats really need to combat. But the loss of support here, whether it's across states like Arizona and Nevada and Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and all the rest of them, actually comes into more of a regional difference than something that I think can be clear-cut across all the swing states. One thing, though, is clear. Joe Biden has lost support from the 2020 election in quite dramatic ways. At the same time, there are levels at which he has lost support. And the region of the country that he has lost the most support is not the Rustbelt region, but in fact the Sunbelt region, which has a higher minority population and a less overall enthusiastic electorate. I look no further than the state of Arizona, which recently elected the Democratic Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs, to be the governor of this state, and Democrats up across the ballot, and re-elected Senator Mark Kelly, a Democrat, by 5 points just a year and a half ago. Arizona, Trump is up by 4.5. In the state of North Carolina, a state that Donald Trump won in the last election by a margin of 1.3%, and all of the polls dated October onwards, Donald Trump has a lead by an average around 8 to 9 points. Again, what was Trump plus 1 is now Trump plus 8.9. The state of Georgia, a state where you find Donald Trump ahead by 7.2%, a state that Joe Biden won in the last election, Raphael Warnock won in the last 2 elections, and Democrats overall have been improving on their margins, not in the presidential. And that last state in that Sunbelt region that's clumped into the swing states, the state of Nevada, where Donald Trump is expected to win by 7 points according to the polls that Joe Biden won by 2.4. But like I said, the extent at which you see a decrease in support in many of these battleground states seems to be more of a regional difference rather than a consistent and overall net loss across these states. For instance, in the state of Wisconsin, Donald Trump leads by 0.6, less than he actually won by in 2016. Very different than any of the rest of the states that I've just shown you. 0.6% is less than a 2-point shift from the 2020 election. The state of Pennsylvania, you see even less of a shift. Joe Biden won the state by 1.2, he's ahead by 0.3. As the only swing state that Joe Biden leads by, it also finds to be the narrowest difference between 2020 and 2024. Now, the only real exception to this rule is the state of Michigan, an exception that I think can be explained largely by the heavy Muslim and Arab populations in Dearborn and across the state itself, a region of the country that overall doesn't seem to be bleeding as much as some of the Sunbelt states, but Michigan is a unique exception. But I will say that based on where the numbers are now versus where they were back in November, as they were increasing from Trump plus 5 to Trump plus 10, you've seen a decrease in overall support down to Trump plus 8 and Trump plus 5. It's the right direction for Democrats that we've seen pretty consistent and pretty standard across states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, whereas the other battleground states, you've really only seen the numbers get worse. While the general election shows Donald Trump with a 1.9% average, the swing states actually match what we see on the national front. But neither candidate is above 50%, and that is a fundamental problem. But when we look at these Rust Belt states in, how they voted in the last election cycle, they really matter in this election because even if Donald Trump does win these remaining battleground states like Arizona, like North Carolina, like Georgia, and Nevada, it only brings him to 268 electoral votes. And in theory, that would be a very good starting point. But it would take a lot more than this to just be the starting point. You'd be flipping 3 states that went to Biden in the last election and winning one that Donald Trump only won in the last race by just a singular point. And that leaves up the Rust Belt region to determine single-handedly the presidency. And right now, Biden leads in Pennsylvania, Trump leads by 0.6 in Wisconsin, and leads by about 5 in the state of Michigan. But walking back the blue wall is the real strategy here for the Biden campaign. When you take a look at where they're focusing all of their efforts in terms of fundraising, especially in their ad blitz, the largest amount spent on any ad blitz in United States history, Democrats are targeting very publicly those battleground states. Every single state I mentioned is on that list of 7 core and key states to the victory for Joe Biden in the upcoming election, and it's all about playing defense. But when it comes down to the core 3, very similar to what we saw back in 2020 when Joe Biden was spending so much time in these 3 states, I remember he was up by 8 in the polls in Wisconsin, up by 5 in the polls in Michigan, up by 6 in the polls in Pennsylvania. These numbers looked very strong in the early October days leading into the election, and a lot of people on the ground were saying, Biden's going to win this election. Why isn't he shifting gears down to Texas, shifting gears over to other states that might all of a sudden be competitive? Visit some of the states where you need Democrats to turn out in the Senate race. Montana, South Carolina, Kansas, right? And I know it seems crazy to think about now with all this hindsight and all this knowledge just about how partisan and how polarized these states have become in favor of either side of the aisle. But what you find to be true to the Biden campaign and true to their strategy of victory is that they were relentless in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so I think that is the strategy here that really gives Democrats so much peace and security that they do still have a chance at winning this election. Because numbers like these in November, it's a done deal and Donald Trump wins. But they know because they're holding out in Pennsylvania and they're holding out in states like Wisconsin, and they could see a pathway in which they walk back Michigan because the polls in 2022 said that you're going to see Gretchen Whitmer win in some cases by 1 or 2%. And she won by 10, 11, 12%, right? And so Democrats are holding out for hope in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, because these are the core 3 states. Democrats did not win Georgia or Arizona in 2012. They didn't win them in 2008. The last time either of these 2 states went blue, it was 92 for Georgia and 96 for Arizona. North Carolina, last time it went blue, was in 2008 by 14,000 votes, and then prior to that was 1976. Nevada had pretty consistently gone blue. The only reason I characterize it as a Republican state is to further exemplify the point that without these 3 Rust Belt states, Donald Trump does not have a pathway to victory. Even if he wins Nebraska's 2nd district, you're sending it to the House of Representatives, which arguably doesn't seem to be looking too fondly amongst Republicans right now, given the fact they've been governing for the past 2 years. And so when I look at these states, when I'm taking a look at, where Biden does well, where Trump does well, I, more often than not, am looking to these Sunbelt states that flipped in 2020 but were very, very narrow as prime opportunities for Trump a lot more than I'm looking at states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, or whatever order you want to put them in. And I think a lot of this also makes sense when you look at the last election. I raised Katie Hobbs as an example. I raised Raphael Warnock as an example. But the bleeding under the Biden administration has already begun, and the electoral repercussions of that we already saw in 2022, really in ways we didn't see it in full display in the Rustbelt. When you take a look at the Senate election results in 2022, you do see that there was a pretty unified front here. Democrats won Nevada, they won Arizona, they won Georgia, they won Pennsylvania, but they lost in Wisconsin. So that actually works as a counter to my point. But there's a lot more that I would like to explain a little bit further on the line. Take away Wisconsin and take a look at the rest of the map, it may seem at face value that it is very Democratic. But when you take a look at the margins, that's really what matters. Republicans nominated one of the worst candidates they could have in 2022 in a year where Democrats were outperforming expectations. And although the polls did predict that Herschel Walker was going to win, a 2-point victory is eerily reminiscent of what Raphael Warnock had over Kelly Loeffler in the 2021 runoff. The difference is Herschel Walker was actually a worse candidate than Kelly Loeffler. And yet Democrats still almost lost this race. Moving over to the state of Arizona, Mark Kelly ran against arguably a very, very bad Republican. Blake Masters was an extremist endorsed by Donald Trump and took on many policy positions that were arguably very unpopular to the average voter, especially in this state. The margin here is somewhat impressive, but certainly not what you might expect. In the state of Nevada, I was more surprised. Out of all the states I just showed you, Nevada had the closest margin, and Catherine Cortez Masto got around 48.8% of the vote to Adam Laxalt, 48%. A very close race. But in Pennsylvania, that's where John Fetterman did quite well. Won by around 5 to 6 points and defeated Dr. Oz, despite being a candidate who survived a stroke, despite being a candidate who was perceived and branded as a far-left extremist and socialist. John Fetterman, for what the campaign was worth, did a lot better than the polls and himself and everybody even expected. But the governor's races is really where you started to see this divide between the Rust Belt region and the Sun Belt region in terms of solid core identities for the Democratic Party and solid margins going into 2024. Arizona might have gone to Katie Hobbs, but it only did so reluctantly. When you take a look down at Nevada, it went to the Republicans. And when you take a look at Georgia, you saw Brian Kemp win by around 7 to 8 points. And so when I look at all of these states, I'm starting to realize here, wait a second. When it comes down to who they want to govern them on an individual basis, when it came down to a number of Senate races and congressional races, ultimately Republicans did a lot better in this Sun Belt region than they did in the Rust Belt. Remember what happened in the state of Michigan? Gretchen Whitmer was supposed to win by 1.2, 2%, 3%. She won by over 10. In the state of Wisconsin, you found that Tony Evers was down by 1, 2, 3 points on election day in the polls. He ended up winning by 3 to 4 points. Then came Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro was going to win by 4 or 5 points. He ended up winning by around 15. Democrats flipped back control of the state Senate, state House, and numerous down-ballot statewide races in the state of Michigan for the first time in 40 years. Pennsylvania is the state where you saw Democrats flip back control of the state House. And in Wisconsin, Democrats had a phenomenal result when it came down to the governor's race that translated into future victories in Supreme Court races in the state of Wisconsin. And so when you take a look at the 2024 map, we are now reminded exactly why this core strategy does rely on the Rust Belt and why it's a lot more likely that these states are blue than any of the states in the South. There's a number of reasons here that I think you do see Biden losing support, because right now he's not the favorite to win Wisconsin or Michigan. But ultimately, Biden's pathway to victory can rely on these 3 core Rust Belt states. And I think you will start to see Democrats shifting where they're going to be focusing on, shifting where they're going to be bringing out the big guns. Josh Shapiro will be there in Pennsylvania. Gretchen Whitmer will be there in Michigan. Tony Evers will be there in Wisconsin. And there will be less and less of a focus, I think, as we get closer to Election Day, for Democrats to play offense, for Democrats to play defense in states that they otherwise might deem to be no longer formidable for them. For example, if Biden is losing by 7, 8, 2 weeks, 2 months out from Election Day in Arizona and Georgia, they may pull out from the campaign altogether, from that race, from that individual state or individual states. I think there is a reason here that these 3 states have pretty consistently been much more solid in favor of the Democrats, even if they are clumped in together as Biden 2020 states. Ideally, on the Biden side of things, they would love to win all the states they won in the last election cycle, but not everything falls into place perfectly. And based on where we are in terms of looking at numbers, looking at core support, and looking at enthusiasm, Biden's best chance at victory is through building back the blue wall, which he seems to be doing now, but needs to keep picking up the pace and expanding on his leads in Pennsylvania, winning over voters in Wisconsin, and doing a complete turnaround in the state of Michigan. But with those 3 states, he wins the presidency. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.